Today, we've begun our debate on Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcast Act, pardon me, and to make related and other consequential amendments to other acts. As its rather long name implies, Bill C-10 is a collection of significant amendments of Canada's Broadcasting Act. The Act has not been amended in a major way for 30 years, and back then, we all watched shows on television, listened to music on the radio, and rented movies at Blockbusters. The Internet was still in its early experimental stages, with few early adopters making dial-up connections. Our phones were attached to the wall and used for making phone calls. At the same time, we had strict Canadian content regulations and Canadian ownership requirements for commercial radio and television broadcasters whose programming was regulated by the CRTC. Today, conventional broadcasters are facing an existential crisis. Private radio and television stations across the country are in dire financial straits, with many on the brink of closure or collapse, creating potential news deserts in parts of rural Canada. They have lost their advertising clients to websites such as Google and Facebook, and their audiences to streaming services such as Spotify, to video sharing sites such as YouTube, and to so-called over-the-top video services, including Netflix, Disney, Prime, BritBox, and others. The CRTC does not regulate any of those international streaming giants. Technically, they have been granted an official exemption, but it remains a somewhat open question whether the CRTC has the legal authority to regulate them at all. At the same time, ironically, production of Canadian film and television has never been more robust, with pre-COVID 2018-19 production levels at all-time highs. Netflix, for example, though it has no regulatory obligation to produce Canadian content, funds a surprising and substantive amount of original Canadian production. It also exposes Canadian-made films and television shows such as Schitt's Creek, Kim's Convenience, or Funny Boy to broad international audiences. On the other hand, other specialty streaming services such as BritBox have little or no Canadian content or production. Disney, for example, does produce shows here, but not shows that have identifiable Canadian themes or settings. C-10 creates a broader regulatory framework for the CRTC. It retains a system of broadcast licenses for conventional broadcasters, but creates a separate category of registered undertakings, which captures streaming services such as Prime and Spotify, which would be subject to CRTC regulation under this new framework. But C-10, in theory at least, does not micromanage that system. It is meant to be a broad regulatory framework which would leave many, indeed most specific decisions to the regulator, the CRTC. Now, updating the Broadcast Act was never going to be easy. There are so many competing interests, so many stakeholders with different visions of what and who the bill is for. And then there is the larger question. Should Canada be seeking to regulate or micromanage online undertakings hosted on platforms outside of Canada at all? The whole idea of broadcast regulation, after all, springs from the earliest days of radio, when Canadian policymakers worried that Canada would be swamped with radio signals from across the American border. That was the genesis of the AIRD Commission, formerly known as the Royal Commission on Radio Broadcasting, which was created in 1927. In 1929, it came back with its recommendations, which eventually led to the creation of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and the establishment of the Bureau of Broadcast Governors, which would evolve to become the CRTC as we know it today. The logic in 1929 was relatively straightforward. There was only a limited amount of broadcasting spectrum, only so much room on the AM radio dial. That spectrum was a public good, and there wasn't much of it to go around. So the Crown, through the broadcast regulator, took on the role of gatekeeper. It decided which radio stations were approved and what their general content would be, to make sure that Canadian listeners were exposed to a wide range of on-air content. That philosophy carried over into the realm of television, and was the philosophical basis for the muscular Canadian content rules championed by Pierre Junot in the early 1970s. The CanCon regulations that did so much to bolster and promote Canadian music, film, and television production at a time when, once again, Canada faced the prospect of Americans steamrolling over our popular culture sectors. But this is not 1927, and it's not 1971, and the technologies we are dealing with today are not radio and television. Back then, the Crown had a clear legal nexus to regulate and control radio and television content. It was, after all, responsible for rationing out the limited number of Canadian TV and radio stations, responsible for managing the spectrum in the national and public interest. But digital disruption has totally overthrown that old order. Instead of limited over-air spectrum or limited cable services, we now have access to what sometimes feels like an infinite number of options, news and information that we can stream on our laptops and phones and tablets. And the technology and the zeitgeist are changing every moment. Just a couple of years ago, it seems we were wrapping our heads around new innovations like YouTube and Facebook and Netflix. Now they are the old establishment players, and the cool kids are migrating to TikTok and Discord and Disney Plus, etc., etc. And we don't just have access to American services next door. People can get their content from content providers in India and Taiwan and Britain and France just as easily. And if the service you want isn't technically available in Canada, well, that's what your VPN is for, to travel the world without ever leaving your Chesterfield or back deck, or your IPTV subscription, which lets you access, or perhaps even pirate, a world of global content. So here and now, precisely, where does Canada find the legal authority, the moral right, and most importantly, the practical power to regulate the content of international streaming services which are not broadcast over Canadian airwaves? What is the legal nexus to regulate or curate programming from international companies? In a borderless digital world, should Canadian consumers be free to choose to watch whatever they like from around the world without government interference? Or should companies that operate in Canada, which take money from Canadian customers, be subject to Canadian regulation? That is the fundamental question at the heart of C-10. Does it even make sense to try to regulate the internet? Or are we trying to impose a cookie-cutter model from the 1970s on a quicksilver medium that defies walls and barriers and national borders? As my fellow Edmontonian, the great communication theorist Marshall McLuhan famously said, the medium is the message, by which he meant that the medium itself changes the way we absorb and respond to the information we receive. In the same way, you cannot regulate a digital medium the way you regulate conventional broadcast or cable television. You cannot accurately regulate digital forms with analog tools. Digital media is consumed in a different, less passive, and more interactive way, in a way that privileges viewer choice, and consumer engagement above all. A digital generation has come of age confidently seeking out precisely the online audio and visual content it wants from around the world. The days when we sat back, read the TV guide, and tamely consumed whatever was scheduled are gone. And of course, there will be a generational schism if we attempt to tell younger viewers that online prefects and proctors are going to be managing what they can watch and hear. Over the last few months and weeks and days and hours, the political rhetoric around C-10 has become somewhat unmoored from reality. So let me take a moment to discuss what the bill does and does not do. C-10 does not impose Canadian content quotas on international streaming services, and it does not require that a specific percentage of Canadian revenues of a streaming service be invested in Canada. Despite what you might have heard, and Senator Housakos is absolutely correct about this, it does not set up some kind of wondrous billion-dollar-a-year production fund funded by international services to underwrite Canadian production. Instead, the bill gives broad latitude to the CRTC to work out appropriate arrangements with each streaming service based on their unique programming models. So don't be misled into thinking this is some kind of instantaneous cash bonanza for Canadian producers. C-10 does not directly regulate the content of internet streaming services. It does not prohibit or regulate hateful content or fake political news or pornography. It does not give the Crown the power to take down your YouTube video or your tweets or your fake posts because they're not Canadian enough or not pure enough. Despite what you may have read or heard, this is not an act about censorship. It does not limit your free speech. The bill, however, does dramatically increase the potential for regulatory gatekeeping. It may, especially as recently amended, limit the service to which we're able to subscribe, and we can rightly debate the merits and demerits of that model. And the bill, as very, very recently amended, imposes, to my mind, an absurd level of direction and specificity about how streaming services curate and display Canadian content. I think those amendments are fundamentally wrong-headed, and I think they misunderstand the meaning of discoverability and the functionality of algorithms. But that's not state censorship in the conventional meaning of the word. C-10 does not reduce or change the obligations of conventional broadcasters. Nothing in the bill absolves them of their current CanCon quotas or their mandatory obligations to invest in Canadian TV and film production. Nor does the bill do anything to address the economic stresses leading to the closures of regional radio and television stations, stresses which are largely rooted in the collapse of advertising markets and the near monopoly companies such as Facebook and Google hold on Canadian advertising dollars. Despite all the language about leveling the playing field, the bill does little concrete to redeem Canadian broadcasters or cable companies or to prevent the development of growing news deserts. In short, after all the flurry of last-minute amendments and all the misunderstandings and misinformation, this bill is in desperate need of a thorough Senate study and revision because there are serious questions that need to be addressed. How do we best strengthen and support Canada's film and television industry? How do we do the same for Canada's music industry? How do we ensure that Canadian screenwriters and songwriters, actors and directors, and producers get the chance to tell Canadian stories? How do we prepare our entertainment industries to compete with the best in the world and to find audiences outside of Canada as well as within? And how do we ensure that all communities in Canada, Indigenous, Francophone, ethnocultural, rural, disabled communities, get access to the information and the entertainment choices that they need and deserve? At the same time, we need to take care that we don't accidentally set up a regulatory regime that smothers innovation, that discourages or squelches emerging online artists or puts them at a competitive disadvantage with legacy players. And here is the core question. Is cultural protectionism still the fundamental model we wish to employ in 2021? Or do we need a paradigm shift that puts the emphasis on preparing our tech sector and our cultural sector to be robust players on a global stage, taking outstanding Canadian content created in French and English and Mandarin and Inuktitut and Punjabi and to the world? I hope that we can send this bill to committee as quickly as possible, not because I am a full-throated champion of this legislation, but because our standing Senate Committee on Transportation and Communication needs time to do a proper study, hearing from witnesses, including consumer advocates and new media producers who were not heard in the other place, and taking the time to figure out the real impact of all these recent amendments on this important legislation. Thank you very much. Merci and hi.
Senator Housakos, did you wish to ask a question?
Would Senator Simons take a question?
I would be delighted to take a question.
I should caution you, Senator Housakos, that Senator Simons has 2.5 minutes left.
So I will be super brief. I'd like you to comment on a couple of things. Number one, you're absolutely right. This legislation doesn't give the CRTC the power to take down content, but you would agree that it gives the power to the CRTC to order platforms to bury content or to take it down. And my second question to you is, we all recognize how powerful the web and the new platforms are today. Does this, it seems to me the last few days on reflection, does this legislation show the divide between the archaic ways we've regulated broadcasting and where young generations around the world and Canadians are in terms of content?
Senator Simons.
I will answer the second question first because it's easy. Yes, it does. That is absolutely what it does. I mean, no one under 30 watches television the way you and I did when we were growing up. You and I are of an age. We consumed media in a completely different way than our children do, and goodness knows how our grandchildren will be consuming it. And we need to have a regulatory framework that is nimble enough to respond to the very quickly evolving technical platforms that we have. It's a bit like, this bill reminds me a little bit of the Maginot Line, the way the French dug trenches so that the cavalry horses would fall in the ditches, and then the Panzer tanks came along, and the Maginot Line didn't do them much good. We're regulating to catch up with where we should have been 10 years ago instead of looking to where we need to be 10 years from now. As to your first question, this is indeed my concern, not that the CRTC can take things down, but that the legislation as currently written compels the CRTC to compel the streaming services to privilege Canadian content, to privilege specific kinds of Canadian content with a degree of granular specificity that I think is completely frankly, it's out of the reach of most of those platforms. That's just not how they work. Their algorithms can't be set to work that way. But I think it's really important that we differentiate. I don't think that this bill censors or regulates speech, but I think it imposes nigh on impossible conditions for for streaming platforms, some of which may simply pull out of the Canadian market, denying us choice. And we all know that anybody under 30 will use their VPN to get the choice anyway. So what are we doing?
Thank you, Senator.